Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Larissa Vigu-Picard, Executive Director of Penobscot History Center. This is our first Zoom program, our first program of the new year. And we are excited to be delivering public programming again and early in the new year, even if it is on screen. We do certainly hope, like I'm sure many of you and all of our sort of sister and organizations, to get back to in-person programming when that is safe. And we certainly hope that that's the case in the summer or fall, but we'll just take it day by day or month by month. We do have some great programs coming up as well that I just quickly want to mention to you before I introduce Laura. In February, we have a fun program we're going to do with Marie Pangborn, who's actually on the call tonight. She is going to do a cooking program, a baking program, and she's using a couple of recipes from the Schofield Whittier House, original handwritten recipes that she has modified for modern kitchens and modern measurements. And she is going to teach folks how to translate historic recipes into modern day recipes. And we will provide the recipes, and she'll do a little mini cooking show on screen. So that'll be a lot of fun. That is February 18th. Coming up in March, we have we're going to do a 2020 highlights reel. Yes, it was a crazy year, but we had a lot of amazing things that went on during the year, and we're going to do that and have a very quick annual meeting as well, and some other fun activities on screen, such as trivia and so forth. So that'll be a lot of fun, I think. That's on March 16th. And then coming up in April, I'm really excited about this. We have two really great researchers, scholars, thinkers, teachers on Wabanaki history. And they're going to be in conversation in a Zoom program. And that's Joe Hall from Bates College History Department, and Lisa Brooks, who teaches at Amherst and wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago called Our Beloved Kin. And it's a new, really new in-depth research into King Philip's War from a Wabanaki or Indian perspective. And so they're going to be in conversation with one another about their current scholarship, a lot of which involves our region, of course, the whole sort of New England region, but also our region of the state. So that's pretty exciting. That's coming up in April. All of those programs are on our website under the events page. If you click on talks and presentations, and they all link to tickets. We did offer almost all of our Zoom programs last year for free. But of course, this is one way that the center earns revenue during our a year is through public admission fees. And so I appreciate your willingness to pay that this evening, whether you're a member and you got that discount, or the general admission folks, who we certainly encourage to become members. So we really, really appreciate that. And it does go right to the operating budget for this year. So I am now going to introduce Laura Almasi and turn things over to her. Laura has been on the board of Penobscot History Center for several years now. In fact, this is her last year. She terms off after this year. And Laura is an internal communications specialist at Hannaford. And she also has a master's degree from the American and New England Studies program at the University of Southern Maine. And she did a whole lot of research, some of which you're going to learn about tonight, during her time there, and has done a lot since about her Franco heritage in Brunswick. And so we're going to learn a bit about that, some family stories. and some of the names you will recognize for sure. And she's also going to talk about a lot of the resources she used and how she used those resources to piece together the details about her ancestors. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to Laura, who's going to share her screen.
I can do this right. All right, success. Well, thank you, Larissa, and thank you for everyone for joining tonight. I see some familiar faces, and I also see some family. So thank you for joining, and I hope that I can not only inspire you to search your own family roots, but also learn a little bit more about the Franco community in Brunswick. Now, as everyone knows, the current health crisis has made all of us sort of stuck at home. And so everybody is looking for their family roots. You see a lot of the Ancestry.com commercials that play in more. So this is a way for you to learn a little bit more about the ways you can find your own history. Maybe how your grandfather walked off the boat with $5 in his hand looking for a new life, or your great-grandmother took the train to America to work in one of the mills in New England. So you don't have to have a historical figure in your family, I think, to really for your family to be important. If you look through your family history, there'll be a lot of rich stories for you to find and a lot of good things to be proud of. So, oops, select here. Oh, is that not going? Page here. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is a family photo of my great-great-grandparents, Elsebert and Hermione Briand. You love those French names for sure. And Albert, who is my great-grandfather. He's the one who has his hand sort of on the back of the gentleman in front of him. That's Elsebert. And then my great-grandmother, Marie Blanche Tendreau, she is sitting sort of front and center with this lovely smile on her face. They are surrounded by Albert's siblings. So French Canadians, just to give you a little bit of background, French Canadians were the largest group to emigrate to the United States via a train, most famously the Grand Trunk Railroad, which had stops in both Portland and in Brunswick. Families left Canada for a variety of reasons, whether it was economic, strife, a better life, more opportunities, a chance to live the American dream. Between 1870 and 1880, about 120,000 or 10% of the French population left their homeland in what became known as the Great Migration after the end of the American Civil War. Around 43,000 French came to Maine looking for work. And at this point, the Irish were moving out of the mills, and owners needed a new crop of workers, and French families were eager to find jobs. They were actually being recruited through their priests and through folks in the United States. And in fact, one French priest in Canada said in 1871, "It is as if a war has ravaged the countryside, bringing desolation to the very heart of our beautiful parishes." The exodus was so great in some areas that, for example, in Saint Hilaire in Quebec, a local baker witnessed, all his fellow villagers leaving. So he decided to pack up his bags and leave, and he went and followed them to Lowell, Massachusetts. So this was a common thing. Whole communities would end up in the same towns and the same cities just because they wanted to be with their own people. And for instance, like with Brunswick, about the 876 residents who could trace their families back to Canada, 270 of them came from the county of Lillette, and 130 came from the neighboring county of Kamouraska. And it was this initial period that Elsebert and Hermione came to America, both as children, and they were from the Kamouraska County. And then so for the next 2 decades, there was even more movement. From 1800 to 1900, nearly 300,000 made the journey to America. And the Tondros came to America in 1891 from Princeville, Quebec. She was, my great-grandmother was 7 years old. And according to family lore, their father, Louis, he sold produce in Canada, and he actually had made a trip to Brunswick to deliver a cartload of potatoes. And even though he was earning a good wage and had a good living in Canada, he was worried about his family's future. So he packed up their bags and they moved to Brunswick. He ended up working as a bookkeeper. He didn't speak any English, so he worked as a bookkeeper for a French grocer. If there's a Tondros in there, you'll understand grocers. And then the older children worked in the mill, in the Cabot Mill, which was the hotspot for French Canadians to work in. And in fact, in 1886, the Brunswick Telegraph reported that the sons and daughters of New England depart, and their places are filled with immigrants. Maine has shared with her sisters in this change, and the census of 1880 show accurately what has long been known approximately. And the paper was correct. I mean, I did a census count, and about 1,041 French Canadians were living in Brunswick in 1880. And in part of that research, sadly, children as young as 8 were working in the mills. So it was a hard life for them. And Albert, who also worked in the mill, later became a baker in town and owned his own store. And along with a lot of other French Canadians, they moved out of the mills and started to own their own businesses. They were druggists, they were tailors, they were milliners. They all served the community at a time when the people in Brunswick really didn't really regard the French as really as being welcome, and they were sort of shut off from the rest of the community. So they served their own people and had their own stores where they spoke French freely and catered to their own families. So this photo, some of you in the audience may recognize these two people. This is Omar and Adjutor Tondro. Omar is on the left with his wife, Alice. Adjutor is on the right with his wife, Bernadette. They owned the grocery store on Main Street, where Tondro's block, which was their block, that's where they had their business. They bought that from the former owner. They bought the grocery business from a former owner in 1906. And when they came to America, they did not go into the mills. They were very resourceful, and they said, we're going to go shine shoes at the railroad, and we're going to make more money, which they did. And it was, they got to be sort of like the head shoe shine kids in the railroad. In later life, Omar became a treasurer of the Chamber of Commerce, and he was president and a longtime member of the Rotary Club. Adjutor owned the house on Oak Street, 12 Oak Street. If you go up that street, you can't miss it. It's this beautiful building on the left, and it used to be a convent. And there's a chapel on this, I think it's on the second floor, where the nuns would have mass. And another brother, Emile, owned Tondro's Bakery on Mill Street. He was a town selectman and a corporator of Brunswick Savings Institute. So much of the information that I learned about my family came from my grandmother and my mother. But I also found many more things about them through records. So today's conversation will really be about how I found some more information about them, and how you also can look and use that same sources and find information about your own families. So these are some of the resources that I will be sharing with you today. We'll look at these websites where you can find all this information. Most of it is free sources, so there's no cost. The only one on here that actually charges is Ancestry. So the picture on the left is my great-grandparents, Albert and Marie Blanche, a little bit older than the other photo, a little bit grayer, a little bit stouter. And in that photo is my grandmother. She is the one with the flowers and rocking the bow, and her younger sister, Florence. And on the right is Philip and Alexina Leclerc with 4 of their children. Now, Alexina and Marie Blanche were sisters. They were Tondros. And we'll come back to these families later, so remember those faces. So another great place to build your stories through school photos. This one is of my grandmother. She is the front row, second from the right. Also, she has a bow on, so it must have been the fashion in those days, with her friend who has her arm around her. That was her best friend at school. Like many French Canadian children, she went to St. John's School. Children spoke French at home and they learned English in school. The original building burnt in 1943 and they rebuilt it also in brick. And the school had an entrance for boys and an entrance for girls. So this looks like this is the girls' side of the entrance. I also went to St. John's School and it looks the same. I thought for sure that this was still the same building because we had the doors on either side of the building as well. So as far as where we begin at the beginning with birth records. This is a great first step to gather information, since a lot of what you'll find requires a birth date and birth records for you to get more information. So on the left is a record of the main record of birth, and the one on the right is a book of births for Brunswick. You'll see, I think for like Massachusetts, you'll see the one on the right more so than the one on the left. And so you'll find name, date of birth, place of birth, sex, color, what number the child is in the family, which helps when you're trying to piece together a family. Parents, their place of birth, father's occupation. Here is Joseph Longton. He went by his name of Florian, as Joseph was a baptismal name. You'll see a lot of the French have either they're prefaced by Joseph or Marie. And here he was born in 1895, and he was born in Topsham. He was the 4th child of Julian and Catherine Briand. His father was a laborer. Parents were both born in Canada, and Catherine Briand was actually Elzabert's sister. So she was. This was Albert's first cousin. And we'll come back to Florian later on in the presentations. But many of these birth records were church records, especially for Catholics. So sometimes you don't find full written records like these. The relatively new form of gathering information. Sometimes you'll see these with older birth labels, like old birth records. And that basically means they've just sort of transferred that to a more usable format. So sometimes they don't often have all this information like this one does. And on the other end of the spectrum is our death records. And this goes the same thing with the births. They're a new way to record information. Usually the forms were not really available before 1880. They didn't really record them like they do today. This one is of Sadie LeBlanc. You can see her first name is Marie S. LeBlanc. She went by Sadie. And she lived at 44 Mill Street, which was Cabot Mill property. And you can see that her father, Phidamine LeBlanc, is a loom fitter, and that would be at the mill. She was, she died on October 2nd, 1918, which, if you know your history, was the 1918 pandemic. She was 27 years old. She was single and she was a dressmaker. Both her parents were born in Canada, and she died of influenza. In those days, usually the death was caused by pneumonia more so than the influenza. And sometimes you'll see cards like this that will say La Grippe. That's another word for influenza. And doing more research on Sadie, we discovered that her cousin, Rose Karen, also died on that day, and they had a double funeral at St. John's Church. Rose's mother and Fidamine were siblings, and so obviously they were close together. She was, I think, Rose was a little bit younger than her. So other resources to go to are cemeteries, a great way to cross-reference dates, though they're not always correct, as you'll see. So on the left is a PDF of St. John's Catholic Cemetery, created by Donald and Mark Cheatham. It's available at Kurtz Memorial Library. It depicts the location of the LeBlanc family gravesite. The second picture is a picture of one of the gravestones. And it's also, like I said, it's a great source for verified information. This is of 3 children of that family. It's written in French. Sometimes knowing a little bit of French does help. So if you see here, Godelie and Fedeline both died on March 24th, 1880. Godeline was 9 and Fedeline was 14 months old. Research shows that they both died of scarlet fever. On the bottom, you can barely see because it looks like the stone is sinking, is Rosanna. She was 9 and she died during the diphtheria epidemic of 1886. And their older brother was Fidamine, who was the father of Sadie, who died in 1918. So this is one of the cases that I've seen of several families in Brunswick during this time, where a child living through a trauma of a death of a parent or a death of a sibling, only to experience it again as an adult with their own child. So another place to get great information are census records. This is a page from Brunswick's 1900 census. It's of Union Street. And I don't know if you can really see, but there's a lot of French families on that street. So if you imagine you had Dunning Street, Union Street, Mill Street, and then Sweat Street, which was beyond Cushing Street, that whole area was really filled with French families in and around the turn of the century. They all sort of lived and congregated next to each other, because right next door on Pleasant Street was St. John's Church. So it was really just a walk across a few blocks to go to church. So this one, you'll see that the census taker was Adelard Racine. And this was the first time that I found that a Frenchman actually took the census, which you hope it helps with French spellings, because a lot of times if it's an English-speaking person and they try to decipher a French name, they botch it. The Briand family, for instance, I think it was the 1880 census, they're listed as Bryants. So you have to, look at the, you can't just go by the name, you have to actually go in and search, because sometimes it's not spelled that way. But in this case, Mr. Racine happened to spell my
Laura, sorry, I accidentally muted you.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So they, like I said, he misspelled, Mr. Racine misspelled everybody's name, Elzevir, Hermione, and Briand. They spelled it brilliant, which is a common misconception even today. They always said, oh, brilliant. No, it's not brilliant. But so you can see from the census that Elzevir Hermione lived at 45 Union Street. He was born in 1860. He'd been married for 18 years. He was from Canada, came to this country in 1875, and he was a naturalized citizen, and he worked in the mill as a weaver. He can read and write. He can speak English, which was unusual, but they did. And he owns his own home, but he still has a mortgage. 5 of his 11 children are still living. There was a lot of mortality rate, especially in this family. After Albert was born, 4 children in a row died very young, either a month old, days old. It was very sad, including one child who died during the diphtheria epidemic, George. He was born and died the same day. According to the census, Hermione came to the country in 1869, and she was born in 1858. And I tried to make the a little bit bigger at the bottom there. So the highlight in yellow is Albert. He was 17 and he worked in the mill. And then also at the time, Hermione's sister, Lucy Gamache, also lived with them, which was common because a lot of times it was a way to get supplemental income, was to either have family come and live with you, or if they were coming from Canada and they were staying for a season, they could live with you, and you could still earn some extra money that way as well. And I don't know if you can't really see this on here, but there was also, one of the neighbors was a woman called Mary Collins, and she was a medicine seller. And I don't know what that means, but I'm curious to find out what she was selling. Oops. Oops. Okay. So this one is the same year, but this is the Tondreau family. And like I said before, they came in 1891, and you can see on the census that it is recorded correctly. And they had a fairly large family. The same information is present here. Louis Tondreau is 61. He's been married for 31 years. He is a baker. He can read and write, and now he can speak English, because before he could not speak English, and now he can. So they rent their home at 4 Sweat Street, which is on the far side of Mill Street. So I think it's that empty lot at the bottom of the hill when you're going up Mill Street. His wife, Flora, is 49, considerably younger than him, and 11 of her 15 children are still living. 3 of her children, Maria, Emile, and Alexina, all work in the mill, and Omer and Agitor are clerks, and I'm assuming that they're clerks at the grocery store. The rest of the children, including my great-grandmother, are not working. She was only 15, so they spared her the mill, probably to work at home and take care of the family, as she would have been the older child to be at home. And the only child born in the United States is Joseph. He was born in 1895. So on the last slide, you saw that Elzevir was naturalized, and this is his, here are copies of his records, both as an index card, which is easier to read, and then the long form. In 1884, a group of local French Canadians, including Elzevir, met at the town hall to discuss naturalization, because they felt that they had no say, they couldn't vote, they had no say in anything that was going on, and they really wanted to become involved in the town business. So they voted, and it was unanimous to all naturalized. And at first, the French in Canada did not want the French to naturalize, because they felt they would be giving up their culture. And when they realized that if the French could vote, they could have a lot of say and sway in town. So they changed their mind and said, oh yes, go, become citizens and vote, so that they could have more sway in town politics. So by 1900, nearly 100 men became naturalized. And so you can see that he was born in St. Alexander, Canada. He was born on January 27th, 1862, which is different from the census, which said he was born in 1860. I'd like to think that this was, the naturalizations records were correct, because otherwise he could potentially lose his citizenship if they found out that he lied. You can also see his signature, which is kind of neat to see your ancestor's signature. And strange enough, even his gravestone is wrong. He has his birth year as 1861. So either no one knew, or they guessed, which was or they, you know, he was, and he's actually 4 years younger than his wife. Maybe he didn't want to be known as being 4 years younger. Who knows? But it's this happens quite often. So so to continue, he came to Brunswick on April 13th, 1878, which is 3 years later than what the census says. So again, I'm thinking this is more of the correct date. His naturalization date was on September 11th, 1886. And Alexis St. Marie, and I cannot pronounce this man's name, Hermanile, I think Coulomb, were his witnesses. And a little bit of trivia here. Alexis St. Marie's 2 children were the first children to die of diphtheria during the 1886 epidemic, which and Albert was 4 at the time of that. So I'm thinking everybody sort of knew everybody. So that's why he agreed to sponsor him, because he knew him from town. Alexis himself was naturalized in 1884. He was 34 years old. I'm assuming probably not long after they agreed to naturalize, because I have a feeling that Alexis, just from what I've been reading, he was more of a leader in town. And so, and another bit of trivia about Alexis is that Agitor's house on Oak Street was actually built by Alexis. And then Alexis was the one who sold the house to the diocese. So everything is all intertwined with the French community. So coupling with the census, a great place to find more information is through the city directories. It's a great way to, you know, cross-reference some information, and or just verify where people lived, who were their neighbors, that type of thing. So here you can see that Albert and Marie Blanche lived at 29 High Street, which is on the other side of Cushing Street. And his bakery was on Main Street. And his bakery was actually located between the Great Impasta and the mill in that overpass area. Sadly, obviously, it's no longer there because it's the overpass. And he opened his bakery in 1919. So to the left is actually an ad from the directory advertising his bakery. His bakery was called Model Bakery. Still don't know why he called it Model. I know that he liked cars. He had one of the earliest cars in town. So maybe he named it after the Model T, or maybe he's calling it a model bakery, as in it's a great bakery. It's a model bakery, because it does say ideal sanitary bakery, while everything used in our products is the highest of quality. And they specialized in pies and cakes, and they had a French baker from France working in the bakery with them. So on the middle is just basically says where they live. You can see the listing of by name. So you can see some of the other Briands in that list. Lorenzo is a brother. Elzebir obviously is there. He's still working as a weaver, but they've moved to Dunning Street at this point. And so then the other on the far right is by street name. So you can see who's living next to who. There's a lot of French people there. And then they lived at 29, and Philip Leclerc shows up again. So they lived with Philip and Alexina. The Leclercs lived on the bottom floor, and my great-grandparents lived on the top floor. And it's still a multi-family house today. And they've actually done some nice siding to it, so they fixed the house up. So in the photo, remember there were 4 children in that photo. Well, since then, by 1922, Alexina has 3 more children, Cecilia, Gus, and Luciana. So there's now 8 children running around that house. And the 5 youngest range from 4 to 10, all girls except for Gus. So I cannot imagine living in the house with all those kids. And so Philip was a tailor, like I said before, and his shop was actually at the corner of Lincoln and Maine, and it's the current home of Barry's Hearing and Optical Center. And if you look at their website, they actually recognize the business. They actually have a picture of the shop on it. So the retail store was on the first floor, and the second floor was the workshop. And early on, he partnered with his brother-in-law, Stanislaus Gervais, and Stanislaus's wife, Corinne, was another Tondreau sister. So they all had businesses, and they all sort of worked with each other. Later on, he worked with his son, Gus, so it became Leclerc and Son. And I can only imagine that, you know, maybe to my great-grandfather's delight, the bakery business is a very early morning business. So I can imagine him sort of skirting away early as he possibly can before anybody wakes up to head down to the bakery to sort of escape some of probably the craziness that was going on at the bakery. And I have to imagine that Stanislaus did the same. My great-grandfather was a very quiet man, so I can imagine he's probably wanted a little bit of peace at the bakery. So military records is another great way to not only see your date of birth, but it can also give you a physical description of a person. So here, Albert is medium height, medium build. He has gray eyes and gray hair. And the date of registration was September 12th, 1918, which was a year before he opened up his bakery. So he was still working as a manager. He was working for his in-laws on Cushing Street, a store that's no longer there. But there was another growth. They opened another store up, and he was the manager there. The store was just around the corner from where Albert lived on High Street, because they're still living on High Street at this point. And I know from according to my grandmother, he loved planes, and he always wanted to fly a plane. So I can imagine if he was 10 years younger, he probably would have wanted to be a pilot. In fact, his brother-in-law, Joseph Tondreau, the only one who was born in America, actually fought in the war. It was said that what he experienced in the war made his hair go white. You may maybe not want to think about joining the war. So many of the French Canadians were translators in the war, which is remarkable because many of the French in town were ridiculed for speaking French. So here they were actually able to help the Allies during the war. And as you can see, the registration was September 12th, 1918, which was probably a couple months before the end of the war. So I'm sure this was just they didn't know when the war was going to end, and they were really sort of getting the older people, because he was 35 at the time. So I don't think he was necessarily going to be, going overseas or anything. And deeds are great ways to, if you want to look if you want to do any research around your house or maybe an ancestor's house of where they lived. This is a deed from Omar Tondreau to Albert for property on School Street, which is where their family ended up moving in May of 1923. So I'm thinking maybe they saved enough money and they wanted to get their own house. Maybe all those kids were too much for Albert, so they moved across town on the second half of School Street, across from Federal Street. But he couldn't get away from his in-laws because Omar and his family lived next door to them. And they had 6 children, but all of them at that point were teenagers. So maybe it wasn't so bad for him there. But this move also was, easier for him just to get to town, because at this point he had owned the bakery. So it was an easy ride to the store. And the Leclerc family remained living at High Street. So this deed actually is typed. A lot of them are not typed. Sometimes they're a little bit hard to read. And sometimes they're also hard to read because they use landmarks such as rocks or trees or some, person from, long ago as a deed holder. And but a lot of times they'll include in the description a volume and a page number, especially if you're working backwards. It's much easier to use those to find the deeds. If you want to do your research, than to try to go through. It's the tree next to the rock that so and so owned, in 1745, that type of thing. And this was pulled from the Cumberland County Registry of Deeds, which is available online, and it's searchable by volume and page number or by name. And you can print these out, which is great because then you can have a copy of them. So newspapers are also great for resources. So remember Florian Longtin. This is a notice of his death. He was a private in the 16th Company 4th Battalion. He died on June 24th at Camp Devens, which, if you remember history on the pandemic, that was where a lot of the initial deaths had occurred in October, in the second wave of the pandemic. It says that he died of pneumonia, but he died it was the influenza outbreak. He was one of the first to die during the epidemic, and actually his funeral was the first funeral in Brunswick to be held. It was held at St. John's Church, and the eulogy was made by the local priest. And his pallbearers were all men that he served with in Massachusetts. So while newspapers can obviously give you information about the death of somebody or some event, newspapers can also give you the gossip and goings on in the community. Today, Facebook has sort of taken the place of a lot of this, where you are and what you're doing type of thing. But in those days, the personals were on the front page, and so it would tell people of where you were going. So and so went to visit a cousin down in New York or something like that. In this instance, this was a reception at the Armory Hall, located at the corner of Maine and Mason, of my great-grandparents after their wedding. They came back from a trip to Canada and Massachusetts, and they had a reception with 200 people and their friends. And I think it's a neat source of information because it sort of tells you the types of things that people did, gifts that they received, and they talk about dancing and people were playing instruments. So somebody was playing the piano, and so the bridal party entered the hall at 8:30 o'clock, and Mr. and Mrs. Bouillon being accompanied by Adjutor Tondreau and Miss Alice LaRue of Lewiston, who attended in receiving. And so they had a reading by one of Albert's sisters, and one of his brothers presented a beautiful bouquet, and they had dancing. And I didn't realize at the time that my great-grandmother was a singer. Did not know that, and only found that out when I was looking this up here. So people were playing and singing. So it's a nice little way to get some information of things that they were doing that you wouldn't normally get. You would hear from family. So some of the items that they received, they got lamps and tablecloths, dishes, platters, pillowcases, utensils, things that you would normally get at a bridal shower. They received during this reception. And this is actually just recently, the Times Record has been digitized at Kirst Memorial Library. So all this stuff is searchable. So you can plug in some names, dates, just peruse through the newspapers. And you can actually download pages of it. So it's nice to have some information on that. And then finally, maps. Maps are also a great visual perspective of where your ancestors lived. This is a map of 1871 of Brunswick. before the French moved out of the mill, the yellow highlight is the area where they would eventually move to. And you can see Elliott Street, that's actually Cumberland Street, they renamed it. Grove Street is actually High Street, and Oak Street going towards Mill Street looks like it hasn't been built yet. But it's just a nice way to see the area of town. So you can see the Cabot Mill, I don't know if I can show it here. The Cabot Mill is up here, and then they're living here. St. John's is over here somewhere. So it's very much a nice little visual. And then these are just the resources that I use within this presentation, some things that I've looked through as I've done research. Some, like I said, everything basically has a fee except for, everything is free except for Ancestry. And if you're not looking through Brunswick's papers, if you want to look through other papers, the newspaper.com and newspaper archives, there's a fee associated with that. But like I said, they are digitized at Curtis right now. And that is it. And I'll take it back to Larissa.
That was great, Laura. Thank you very much. It was fun to learn about all the different way the families are connected in town, and then how you did all of that research. It's a really wonderful kind of checklist of where to go to find these details. I'll just say that we are definitely free for research to members, but there is a fee for non-members. So that is a great reason to become a member, among other reasons. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Laura to stop sharing her screen. And we'll go to gallery view. If you'd like to ask Laura a question, you are welcome to put a question in the chat box, or if you would like to just raise a hand if you're visual on screen, or raise the icon hand that's in Zoom, and you can unmute yourself and ask away. Anybody would like to make a comment or question? I see the Colavets would like to say something, so please do go ahead.
Hey, cousins.
Hey, how are you? Hey, Laura, we've been wondering about pictures because
Yes.
Pictures are so much fun.
Absolutely.
And at least this generation hasn't seen pictures of some of these bakeries and grocery stores. Have you come across anything like that?
I have seen, as far as like the businesses themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, a lot of times the family, our pictures are really of people. Finding businesses is something I've been trying to do. Like I've been trying to find a picture of my great grandfather's bakery, and the only thing I can find looks like they were about ready to tear down that section of town, and you could just see it sort of boarded up. I know there's some in newspapers. There's actually a wonderful photo. I think it's in the Brunswick Record of the Tondro bakery, grocery. They have, and this is later in life, so they had Agitor and Omar next to the store. And I really haven't seen anything of. And of course, I know when the Tondro's block burnt down, I think it was like 1940. Totally. Obviously, they had a picture of that in the paper, but that wasn't anything obviously you wanted to see. You wanted to see the building itself. But I am searching for photos of the family businesses. Like I said, the LeClaire tailor shop, they actually and I believe that's a Pajevskit's photo there. So I would certainly check in with Larissa. I know that when I was looking for my great-grandfather's bakery, I didn't know what it was called. And I went in there and looked and looked and looked. And actually, they found it as Model Bakery. It was listed. They had some cross-referencing. So certainly would check out Pajevskit to find if there's any photos and stuff there. Because like I said, the one for the LeClaire's, they actually had a shot. They had a photo of it that they had given to Barry's to post on their website. So certainly I would look there.
There was
We
another one.
definitely have some Tondro photos and front of, the front of the store and that kind of
Exactly.
thing.
You
We
do?
absolutely do. So come on in and we'll pull them out.
Excellent.
Can you introduce one?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have we have a Tondro here. Of course, Laura, you know, this is Pat and Andy DeHaze, and Pat's grandfather was Emil Tondro.
Oh,
Bakery.
email. Yes,
Best bread in all of Maine.
absolutely. He had the bakery. He had Tondro's Bakery. Absolutely. Yep.
And consequently, we all live on Tondro Point.
Well, I didn't want to get into that, but that was a sort of a collective that I think it was around 1906, 1907. They bought the land in Harpswell that's now called Tondro's Point, and the family had that property, and there was only one cottage on there at the time, and everybody went down there, and then they divvied up the land, and everybody has bought. Everybody in the family had a plot of land. And they built a cottage on there, and that's my dream, is to get one of those cottages one day, to go back home.
So what year did you say that land was bought?
I think it was around I think it was around 1906. Actually, I don't know if you've seen this.
That's not right.
Priscilla Rowe actually wrote a little history.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so I think she said in here it was like 1906, 1907, because it was after my great grandparents were married, and they were married in 1906. So, but you can look in the deeds on the Cumberland site, and they'll tell you, because I think I might have a copy of that. So I can probably send it to email.
That'd be fun.
It would be great.
Of that.
Exactly.
Everybody.
That's what my mother told me, but there's a little.
Yeah, because I know they ended up having, like I said, one cottage, and they would actually, somebody in the family was a priest. There's always somebody in the family with the priest who were Catholic, and the priest would come down and say mass. So
Right.
they'd have to come up to town to do it, which I think was kind of cool.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
that was fun.
It's just
Yeah.
house calls.
absolutely.
I like the doctor.
Exactly.
Awesome. It's neat to have some cousins or what have you on
Yeah.
screen. I see Rob with his hand up.
Sure.
Rob,
Hey, Laura, good to see you.
good to see you.
First of all, I was very impressed with your presentation, especially when you brought it into the present tense, because I feel as if I'm living your ancestors' life to a great extent, and that's a good way to make a presentation. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, or actually ask a question of you,
Mhm.
is Omar. What was his relation to you?
He was my great uncle. So he was my great grandmother, Marie Blanche, and him they were siblings.
Okay.
And
Well, what impressed me is that you said that he achieved the chairmanship of the Chamber of Commerce in Brunswick.
mhm.
It wasn't a segregated chamber.
No, not at that time.
Yeah.
Not at that time. He actually, I think they originally had a French business club for businessmen, and then they merged with another group to become the chamber, and then they sort of became one group.
Mhm.
Because in the beginning, they were still pretty much segregated, but after a while, once they started to get more influence in town, especially the Tondros, then they started to sort of really sort of accept them, and then that's when they rose through the ranks, and things weren't separated so much, but there was still that separation of language. My grandmother remembers in the the 20s, 30s, and 40s that they would still laugh at the kids for speaking French and that type of thing. So there was still that that kind of meanness, that nativism. But as far as the business world, they were big shots in town, really. So
That's great. Very impressive. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Do we have June would like to ask a question? Go ahead.
Oh, you're on mute, June.
You?
I really enjoy listening to this, Laura, really. I moved to Brunswick only in 1970, but I was teaching French at Brunswick High School that year. And, my 9th grade French class was basically all students who had come from St. John's. And they spoke French at home. And actually at Cottle's, people were, still speaking French. But they didn't, they had to learn how to write. I mean, they didn't know how to write. So it was very interesting to me.
Yeah, so a lot of times they did half a day of English, half a day of French at school.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that Curtis Library, in the past anyway, has a free use of Ancestry.
Yes.
So if you didn't want to pay a fee to do Ancestry, you can do it through Curtis Library.
And I think actually right now they might have it online. I think if you log into the library website with your library card, I believe you can. They put up because of COVID, right? So you actually, it's hard to go in there. So I think you can go in and you can actually access it through online.
Yeah.
The only thing is you can't build trees, right? So you basically would have to download some of that information that you have and then sort of build a tree yourself. And the directories, a lot of the city directories in Brunswick are also available online.
Through Curtis?
Through Curtis, yes. There's a gap in some of the earlier years, but there's a lot on there. And I think they have most of the ones that aren't online in the library itself as well. So if there's a missing year, you might have to pop in.
I see somebody has put a comment in the chat box that says, I believe Ancestry Library is currently free from home until at least March or April.
I believe that's correct. Yes. Yep.
Excellent. And I see Candace, I believe, had a hand up. Is that true?
That is true, but that's what I was going to say is that Ancestry is free, has been free through the pandemic. So take advantage from home. Its search engine is terrible. It's like one of the worst I've ever seen, but it's free.
Historian extraordinaire.
Do we have any final comments or questions for Laura? If not, I would just want to say thank you so much to Laura. That was a great presentation. And thank you to everybody else who joined us tonight. And please do consider coming back for one of our upcoming programs. We do have a lot of the sources that Laura spoke of tonight. We have city directories. We certainly have lots of maps. We have cemetery records, some military records. So there's a lot of ways to do research on your ancestors at Pejepscot. And it's wonderful to just have this network of resources available to access. Certainly there are still mysteries that are hard to uncover and, brick walls that people run into, but we will do our best to try to help you uncover what you're looking for. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a good evening. And we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.